Hey, everybody. Let's learn about the 7 core components of a strong informative speech topic. The way that we created this content was we went through all of the NSDA finals videos. We started thinking about what are the speeches that are being really successful in this event. And we realized that there were 7 core components that emerged: intellectual surprise, visual potential, personal connection, moral stakes, audience relevance, narrative trajectory, and ethical complexity. Now, not every speech necessarily excels in all of these. I think this is actually a part of info that makes it a little bit trickier than other speech events. In other speech events like extemp or original oratory, we oftentimes see a clear and consistent set of criteria that make it very predictable what types of speeches are probably going to stand out. And I think you can really reverse engineer that. Whereas in informative, it's a little bit different. Some speeches lean a little bit more into these components than others. So some will have much stronger visual potential, others will have weaker visual potential. Some will have a really high moral stake, some might have a stronger personal connection. And so not every speech really has all of these in a very, very strong way. But I think the thing that we have seen is the best speeches combine as many of these as possible, and that strength in some areas can balance weaknesses in others. And that especially the best championship speakers really end up utilizing almost all of these. So it's really hard to create one size fits all rules for informative speaking, but I think this is a very helpful framework. So let's jump in and learn about these. This is a little bit of a doozy. There is a lot of content here, but I think it's really important to create this framework. So first one, and I think this is important no matter what type of speech you're going to create in info, this component is probably the most important one. And this is what I would like to call intellectual surprise. The guiding question here is: does your topic reveal something unexpected, counterintuitive, or newly reframed? One of the biggest mistakes I see info speakers make is they just want to stand up and they just want to dump information about a topic without really thinking about, hey, is this something that people actually, is this revealing something new about the topic? If you just stand up and you just tell me the mechanics of how a computer works, you're not really reconceptualizing my understanding of a computer. You're just giving me technical information that I probably don't really care about. And so the key thing here is you want a topic that can challenge what people think they know or reveal hidden complexity in something seemingly simple. And there's a lot of good examples of this. You can see the play speech on the right. And by the way, what I've done in this video is given a lot of examples from national finalists. And so you should be able to search up and look at these speeches. And I really recommend watching as many of these as possible, because the more informative speeches you watch, the better you will understand exactly what the meta of the event is and what works. So in 2024, one of the finalists gave a really interesting speech about play, where she said, look, play isn't just for fun. It's not just something kids do. It's an essential biological need that's increasingly being deprived from childhood. And she also explored some of the aspects of it, like the gendered components of play. And so that was taking something that I think I know something about. Like, I think I know about play. I don't think there's much there, and revealing a much deeper layer of complexity to that, which ultimately makes the audience say, wow, I never thought about it that way before. And so I think this is the useful formula that you want in your notes. Getting to the place where you get the audience to say, or I guess this is the formula you should have for yourself, is you think X about the topic, but actually Y, which matters because. I think that's a really good formula. Another example I put here was a 2024 speech. This one was about air. And again, if you told me you were going to give me a speech about air, I'm rolling my eyes. But this speaker did a really good job of making it clear that, yeah, we think of air as being free and unlimited, but actually it's becoming a purchased product. It's becoming a commodity, and it has racial and economic disparity implications. Really interesting. So that intellectual surprise, changing the way I'm thinking about something, is a very important part of informative speech. Here's some tips about how to generate or create intellectual surprise. Find the hidden story behind a topic. What's the surprising story behind something familiar that changes how we understand it in the present? Flip an assumption. So what do people think they know that's actually wrong? Third, you could reveal a hidden system. So like, what are the invisible forces shaping something we see every day that we don't realize, or that we're not aware of? Fourth, you could connect to the unexpected. So how are two seemingly unrelated things actually connected? And fifth, challenge the timing. So what do people think is new that's actually old, or vice versa? All of these are great strategies to trying to create intellectual surprise. But again, gonna emphasize, I think this is probably the most important one, because if your topic is boring and dry, I'm just not gonna pay attention. Component number 2, visual potential. The guiding question here is, does your topic have an inherently visual component to it that requires visual aids? In the past, visual aids used to be thought of as kind of window dressing, just a fun decoration, a cherry on top, if you will, to add after the kind of core content of your speech. But I really think that's not a great or productive way to think about visual aids. Info is the only event in all of speech and debate where you get visual aids. And so really clever speakers incorporate visual aids and make them central to their topic. Info, at the end of the day, it's visual. The best info topics should feel like they could only be done in the event because the visuals are integral to the speech topic itself. Look at some examples on the right here. Janai Howard in 2025 talked about how colorism in photography, how we have to see the biased photographs to be able to understand the problem of colorism in photography. So the visuals here are literally the evidence. If you can't see the pictures of how colorism affects photography, the topic wouldn't work nearly as well. Or the second place InfoWare that year in 2025 gave a really interesting speech about the dominance of sight as our sense. And she uses so many visuals to prove her point in real time, like asking the audience to judge the quality of a music performance only with the visual aids of how the musician is playing it, proving that we listen with our eyes much more than with our ears. There was a lot of interesting stuff like that. Another speech from that year was on school architecture. Obviously, that's very visual. Like, if we can see powerful, clear comparisons between old window-filled schools and modern bunker-style buildings, that makes the argument so much more clear than if it's just verbally explained. So, key point here is avoid thinking of visuals as purely decorative. They should be essential. Try to find topics that are really going to lend themselves to really interesting visuals that can be integral to what you are incorporating into your speech. Third component is personal connection. Guiding question here is, do you have an authentic story, lived experience, or emotional stake in this topic? There's a lot of ways that you can create a strong personal connection. You can think about your identity. So for instance, one of the Bellarmine speakers who made the final stage, Gavin Griffin, you saw that his speech was about his biracial identity. Very strong personal connection. And that obviously ties into his personal experience as well, though you can imagine personal experiences that don't necessarily attach to your identity, something that affects your family or community, or even just like a very genuine curiosity or passion about the topic. I think this is really understated, but it's really important in informative speech that if you have a really genuine curiosity or passion about the subject, that just it comes across so clearly. And if you've created a speech that's just trying to check boxes, but you're not interested in it, then that also becomes pretty evident. An important note is this doesn't need to be trauma. I think that's a common misconception that speakers have. And I've seen plenty of speakers incorporate themselves into their speech without it necessarily needing to be trauma. And so don't always feel like it just needs to be something traumatic for it to work. And I also think another way to think about this, and this third bullet point, is finding out what are you uniquely qualified to speak about. And this is where I want to connect it to the idea of ethos or credibility. A big mistake that I think high schoolers in general make, but especially in info, is they pick topics that it's clear, like, why would I listen to a high school student on this, right? And sometimes you can garner that ethos, but I think oftentimes the speeches that work really well are speeches that have a strong personal connection to that individual, so it becomes clear that they have something to add here. Like when Janai Howard is talking about her own fear of school picture day because she's afraid of what she's going to end up looking like. All teeth literally know their defining features, as she says in her speech. That personal experience makes her feel like she actually has something she's uniquely qualified to talk about that. And that's interesting. Or Violet Tran, a speaker in 2024, gave a speech on parentification, which is defined as like role reversal in families where siblings are now having to do the parental work of raising children. And again, I think her lived experience with that gives her authority to speak on the topic. So in general, finding things that, speak to either your generation or your identity or your experiences, just add that credibility in addition to making the audience feel a more authentic and genuine connection from you. Something you definitely want to avoid, though, are forced connections that feel artificial or made up. I see speakers do this where it's clear you're just trying to draw the audience's heartstrings, but you don't actually feel that strong of a personal connection, and that never works. A few other points or tips for building personal connection you can see here. First is to reflect on your identity. So what defines your identity? I list some factors here. And what are your life experiences? And I think more importantly is dig deeper into that. Like, what do people often not understand about your identity? And what are like intersections of your identity that are more complex? I remember when I was working with Gavin Griffin on his topic on biraciality that ended up making the final stage. He originally wanted to give a speech actually on immigration, and there were reasons why we strayed away from that topic. But I remember asking him a bunch of questions about like why he ultimately wanted to talk about that. And fundamentally, we realized that he wanted to talk more about his life experience of being in this really unique situation where his dad had been born in America, his mom wasn't. He was biracial. He inhabited kind of two different cultures, and he was trying to bridge those two cultures. And he was embodying some unique experience and identity that neither of his parents had. And so that was like a really interesting space and experience that we wanted to explore. And so we started there kind of exploring that. And then we said, well, let's make biraciality the topic. There's so much interesting stuff to discuss there. And then you can also think about like, all right, I have aspects of my identity I want to talk about. What topics, what experiences in the world or objects in the world does this intersect with that I'd have something to say? Another tip is to just like dig deeper. How does a potential topic, so if you're starting with topics as opposed to your identity, like how do topics affect your daily life in ways you haven't considered? That could be a way to bridge a connection there. Third is to use your perspective. So how does your generation, your community, your background give you a unique lens on an issue? I think that's a really useful question to ask. And then finally, just like a curiosity, right? What about this topic genuinely surprises or fascinates you? Ideally, you're an info because you're a curious person that is interested in learning more about the world in a deep way. Component number 4, moral stakes. This one's pretty straightforward. It's, does the topic expose harm or injustice or systemic failure, something that needs to change? And so this component really explains why just standing up and talking about your favorite video game for 10 minutes probably isn't going to be a winning strategy. Actually, there's another component that will do that as well. But you want to give urgency. You want to answer so what. Notice all the speakers that stand up, they're not just doing a deep dive on a random topic that has no implications or stakes for anybody. It is actually developing stakes that matter. And you can see here, I've created a list here. Physical harm, for instance, is one type of stake. Psychological damage, so like mental health effects or trauma or emotional harm. You could have social injustice, so forms of discrimination or unfair treatment or inequality. You could have economic impacts, so financial costs, lost opportunities, resource waste. You could have democratic or civic consequences, so that could be like threats to rights, freedoms, or civic participation. And you could have cultural loss, disappearing traditions, languages, or practices. And I'm sure that there are stakes that I didn't even think of here. The important thing, though, is that you develop some sort of implication that gets us to understand, like, oh, wow, this topic matters. And imagine how powerful it is if you combine this component with component number 1 on intellectual surprise. Obviously, if you stand up and like your speech is on access to healthcare, like I'm gonna be able to predict the moral stakes really, really easily, and I'm not gonna be particularly surprised. But if you do something like look at these examples here, the bottom one in the speech about air. Now, I don't typically think about air as having some sort of moral stake or harm or injustice or systemic failure that has serious implications. But that speaker did a really good job of connecting the commodification of air to racial injustice, like pollution in minority neighborhoods, and the deadly cost of life-saving inhalers. Bringing the stakes to something that is surprising is really, really a good combo meal, right? If I am being surprised by what I'm learning about this and you bring it to moral stakes, that's such a good combo. So that's why, again, key conceptual framework to have here. The more that you can stack these different components together and combine them, the more of a multiplier you get. If you just have a speech with only moral stakes and not the other ones, it's going to land flat. Or it's going to feel too moralizing. It's going to feel too obvious, probably. At that point, you should just do original advocacy. And I see this a lot where people just want to talk about some societal harm. And that's like, if you only want to talk about harms, go into OO or OA, because those are the events that talk about that. Some other examples, Jack Simon, this was a really interesting speech that talked about youth gambling, connected it to death threats against athletes and a rise in intimate partner violence, as well as just like the pervasive effects on teenagers and young people. So the stakes are like really immediate and severe. And then in the speech on colorism in photography, it wasn't just like, hey, bad school pictures, or even just like overall, kind of stereotyping or a vague sense of prejudice. It was connected to life or death issues like medical misdiagnoses and racial bias in the justice system. So really interesting stuff there. You want to bring it to that level. Component number 5, audience relevance. Guiding question here is, will people even care? Even if they haven't heard of this before, can I help them to see why it matters to them? And this is, I think it's a little bit related to the other ones we've been talking about, but you can imagine a topic that would be set in some other distant part of the world that really doesn't affect the audience, that they don't really see any immediate connection to, or something that like you're very nerdy about, like maybe you love World of Warcraft, but is that going to be something that the audience relates to? And just know that oftentimes your audience are going to be adults and parents. So if your audience is adult and parents, are they going to care very much if you stand up and talk about World of Warcraft? Even if you talk about like the economic implications of World of Warcraft, you give it some stakes, something like that, is that really going to be something that parents are interested in? Probably not. So you want to make sure that your topic can build a bridge to your listeners' lives, values, and experiences in a meaningful way. You want to make sure that your topic implicitly has a clear connection to the audience that answers like, why does this matter to me? Otherwise, they won't care. Now, I think a way around this is if you have a topic with a very high personal connection. So, for instance, Gavin Griffin giving a speech on biraciality, is everyone going to understand the experience of being biracial? Absolutely not. But is the personal connection there? And same with colorism in photography. Is the personal connection just so powerful that the audience can't help to be moved? Of course. And do those speeches tap into deeper, more universal human themes about belonging and acceptance and understanding one's own place in the world? Totally. And so once you start getting to those more universal themes, I think that helps a lot. And so you can see the examples here of how these speakers kind of build audience relevance through their speeches to make it so that like the audience feels motivated by what's going on. Some more tips about how to do this is, one, you can connect to daily experience. So how does this show up in your everyday life? Second, you can appeal to shared values. That's what I was just hinting at. So justice, fairness, freedom, safety, belonging, success, all of those things. You can use generational understanding. This is referencing shared cultural touchstones. I know this wasn't an informative speaker, but I think On God did this quite well in his original oratory, in his opening introduction, talking all about 1980s pop songs. I think is clever for so many reasons. Obviously, it tied into his speech on prayer, but it also was really clever because it helps to build a bridge to the audience, because most of the audience were alive in the 80s. Like, they were listening to those pop songs. It's something everybody knows super well, so it builds that bridge from them. Creating future relevance is another way to do it. This is the fourth one. So how will this affect people in the future? That's a pretty easy way to do it. And then also finding those deeper, more universal human emotions like love, fear, hope, frustration, curiosity, etc. Component number 6, narrative trajectory. The guiding question here is, does this topic allow me to tell a story with emotional or intellectual progression? And this is really important. Your topic should unfold as a journey, and we'll definitely talk about this in greater depth for the outline stage. But you want it to not just feel like a set of disparate facts or aspects that don't feel connected in any logical or coherent way. And so some types of progressions that we'll see, and we'll look at examples in just a moment, are historical progressions. So like, how did we get here? What changed over time? Where are we going? There could be a problem evolution. So how has this issue developed or worsened? There could be a discovery journey, like what did we not understand before that we now know? But regardless, I think thinking about the narrative trajectory of your speech is really important, and making sure that there is one there. So look at this example. This speech on Black hair history talked about in the past, braids have existed for thousands of years in various African tribes. Different patterns and styles were used to communicate one's age, religion, tribe, or wealth. So kind of starting distant past. Then showed the problem. So since some of the earliest encounters between white and black people, oppressors have remained committed to taking away the history found within our hair. And so now the speaker had a whole aspect talking about the ways in which braids were not just swept under the rug, but like actively oppressed. Many black people had to start straightening their hair, or they cut off their braids, et cetera, et cetera. And then third, the speaker started to show how acts of resistance began to emerge, where like the natural hair movement of the 60s allowed people to ditch the hair straightener for a metal pick instead, and to actually start growing their braids out. And then flash forward to the present, she made the point that, look, race-based hair discrimination continues to be a prevalent issue in the workforce and the classroom. So you can see there's a narrative trajectory there, kind of going from the past to the present. Same within this speech on birthright citizenship. She picked an issue that we all think we kind of know something about: birthright citizenship. It's heavily in the news, especially with things that the second Trump administration had discussed. But she winded the topic back to the origins. So, what are the constitutional foundations and early court cases around birthright citizenship? Where did this concept come from? Showed how it evolved over time. So, how did the interpretation change? Then brought it to current controversies. So, what are modern political debates and their implications around it? And then brought us to the future implications of what's at stake in ongoing discussions. And so that was the kind of trajectory there. Final component is ethical complexity. The guiding question here is the topic more than just this is bad? Does it have nuance, tension, or layered perspectives? And this really pairs with the component I was talking about before in terms of moral stakes. One of the dangers I see students do is they just pick a topic and they're just like, well, I've developed so many implications, but all of your implications just point to one overwhelming conclusion. It's like, look, this thing is really bad. You can imagine a really weak version of this for ethical complexity would just be like giving a speech on social media where you just stand up and you just discuss how bad social media is for the entire speech. Or maybe you just like give a speech on stereotyping and you're just talking about how bad stereotyping is. And in both those cases, there's like not great reasonable counter arguments. So it's not very interesting. Or like standing up and saying drunk driving kills people or education is important. Like these aren't really hot takes that have much complexity or nuance in them, so they're going to be kind of boring. So I think the best info topics resist simple answers. I think they acknowledge multiple perspectives. They have competing values. And that doesn't mean that you're neutral. All of the speeches that I've been talking about, they don't ultimately land at a place of like, well, this is so complex, therefore we should have no meaningful thoughts on it. They acknowledge complexity and they still do advance, often implicitly, a clear viewpoint. And so I think it's still really important. You'll still kind of have a take at the end, but it's important that there's nuance there. So let's look at some examples. The national champion in 2024 on drag acknowledged both the artistic and cultural value of drag as an art form, and also legitimate concerns about age-appropriate content while distinguishing between drag and transgender identity. So really peeling back those layers as opposed to just taking one side, but then builds to this conclusion that regardless of anyone's personal opinion about drag and its appropriateness around children, these drag bans are overreaching and misdirected. So building to a point like, hey, we can acknowledge the most valid take on the other side, but ultimately bans are overreaching and misdirected. Or birthright citizenship. She presents both the Republican and Democratic arguments fairly while maintaining her own position, especially talking about her family's own immigrant experience. And so she builds in that ethical complexity throughout rather than oversimplifying or just straw manning what the other side is saying. So those are the 7 components. Let's talk about creating ethical complexity. I think here are my tips here. You can first acknowledge competing values. So where do principles conflict? Second, you can present strong opposing arguments. What do thoughtful people on the other side believe about this? You can third, identify unintended consequences. So how might solutions create new problems? You can fourth, explore cultural differences. So how do different communities view this issue? And fifth, you can consider multiple timescales. What's good short-term versus long-term? How have we identified or how have we dealt with this at different historical points? Something like that. So now we've made our way through all 7 of the components, and I think here are the key takeaways that I want you to have. 1, the more components that are present, the better. You don't need perfect scores in everything, but significant weaknesses in any area can definitely limit your success. So you definitely don't want to just like have a 0% in any of these categories, even if you're not at like 100% in all of them. Again, you probably won't be able to get to 100%, and I don't even think there's many examples of speeches that really get to all of them, or that really check all of those boxes. So don't think of it as all of these boxes need to be perfectly checked to the absolute maximum. But again, the more you have, the better. Second, balance matters. Right? A topic that's just all in on one, like all stakes but no surprise, or all surprise but no relevance, it just won't reach its potential. So you want to have a good balance of as many of these as you can. Third, authenticity beats perfection. So a genuine topic, a genuine connection to your topic will carry you a lot further than a technically perfect topic that's checking a lot of boxes that you don't actually have a strong connection to. Fourth, complexity shows maturity. So I think judges and audiences really respect speakers who acknowledge nuance rather than just oversimplifying important issues. And fifth and finally, your perspective matters. The 7 components, I think, help to identify strong topics, but ultimately it's your unique voice, it's your viewpoint that make a speech truly memorable. So the more that you can bring yourself and your own authentic touch into a speech, the better. So hopefully this helps. Hopefully you have a clear understanding of the 7 criteria for successful info topics. Hopefully you have a good framework for how to think about utilizing these. Again, one of the best tips I can give you at this point of your journey is to watch as many national finalists as possible and to really think about at every moment that you're watching it, how are they utilizing these 7 components? Which of these components does this speech really excel at? Which is it weaker at? And how does that help me to better understand this event?